During Sunday dinner, a 16-year-old girl knocked on our door, and when my adult son answered, she asked him, "Are you my dad?" And the next 8 minutes detonated 9 years of my son's marriage in front of his entire family. My son is named Caleb. Caleb is 36. Caleb has been a partner at a downtown law firm since he was 32. Caleb has been married to Octavia for 9 years. They have 2 kids, a 6-year-old named Ren and a 4-year-old named Theo. Octavia was sitting across from Caleb at the table when the doorbell rang. My husband Hendrik and I were at the other end. The roast was halfway carved. Caleb opened the door. The girl on the porch was wearing a school uniform and holding a manila envelope. She said, "Are you Caleb Whitman?" He said yes. She said, "I am Brielle. My mother is Petra Marlowe. You dated her 17 years ago. My mother died of cancer 4 months ago. I have a DNA test in this envelope. It shows you are my biological father with 99.9% certainty." Caleb went still. The name Petra Marlowe had registered. Caleb had been 19 when he had dated her. The relationship had lasted 4 months in their sophomore year of college. Petra had moved across the country at the end of that semester. Caleb had assumed she had wanted out. Caleb had never been told she was pregnant. Brielle handed him the envelope. Caleb opened it at the door. The DNA test was from a major laboratory. The percentages were unambiguous. Brielle also handed him a second document. It was a copy of her birth certificate. The father section had been left blank. The blank had been deliberate. Octavia had walked up behind Caleb during the silent reading. Octavia read over Caleb's shoulder. Octavia's first words were not to Caleb. Octavia's first words were to Brielle. She said, "Come in, honey. You must be cold. Let's get you something to eat." The deciding to be a person who responded to a 16-year-old at the door with kindness instead of suspicion was the kind of decision that told me what kind of woman my son had married. Brielle sat at our dinner table. Brielle's mother had not had any family. Brielle had been living with her mother's best friend, a woman named Marisol who was 45. Brielle had taken 3 buses and a train to find us because Brielle had read her mother's old journals after Petra had died. Brielle had decided she wanted to know her father before she turned 18. Caleb cried at the table. Caleb said, "Honey, I would have been in your life. Your mother never told me." Brielle said, "I know. My mother wrote about that. She was 19 and scared, and she made a choice she stuck with. She did not want me to find you until she died." Marisol drove 4 hours that night to bring Brielle's things. Marisol cried when she met Caleb because Marisol had been praying that Petra's daughter would have a father waiting. The custody worked itself out over the next 8 weeks. Brielle moved into Caleb and Octavia's house permanently. Octavia introduced Brielle to her own parents as our daughter. The hour was the word Octavia had chosen. Ren had treated the information as if it had been the most obvious thing in the world. Ren had asked Brielle to read bedtime stories the first night. Theo at 4 had been confused for about a day and had then decided Brielle was his. That was how I thought the story ended. A brave girl, a good son, a wife who chose grace, and a family that bent instead of broke. 4 months after Brielle walked through our door, I was watching her pack boxes in the guest room at Caleb and Octavia's house, and I felt something I had not felt in a long time, which was the feeling that everything was going to be okay. Brielle had her university acceptance letter pinned to the corkboard. She was folding shirts into a suitcase while Octavia sat on the bed sorting through a bag of dorm supplies. They had a rhythm. It was the rhythm of 2 people who had figured each other out. Caleb was lighter than I had seen him in years. Marisol was coming to the going-away dinner I was hosting that weekend. I had the guest list written on a notepad, and every name on that list was someone who loved Brielle. I was wrong. The following Tuesday, it was just me, Hendrik, and Joachim for dinner. Joachim is Hendrik's older brother. He has been part of our family dinners for decades. He is the uncle who never misses a birthday. We were halfway through the meal when Joachim set his fork down and looked at Hendrik. He said, "You realize your son is paying full tuition for a girl he met 8 months ago, right?" I felt a quick flash of irritation but kept my mouth shut. Hendrik gave him a look that said, "Drop it." But Joachim did not drop it. He said, "I'm not saying anything against the kid. I'm saying someone should be asking whether the paperwork is airtight. What happens if the biological mother's family comes out of nowhere and sues?" I said, "Petra had no family. That's the whole reason Brielle came to us." Joachim smiled. It was a small smile, not mean exactly, but knowing. He said, "That's what the girl told you." I did not like the way he said the girl, but I told myself it was just Joachim being Joachim. 2 days later, Octavia called me. She said, "Did you give Joachim our family lawyer's number?" I said no. Octavia was quiet for a second, and then she said, "He called the lawyer's office yesterday asking about Brielle's custody filing. The receptionist thought he was family, so she confirmed the case number." My whole body went tight. This was not a comment at a dinner table. This was Joachim picking up a phone. Joachim calling a lawyer who was not his lawyer. Joachim asking about legal paperwork that had nothing to do with him. I called Joachim directly. I said, "Joachim, why did you call Caleb's lawyer about Brielle?" Joachim did not hesitate. He was completely calm. He said, "Because nobody else is thinking clearly. You have a stranger's child living in your son's house, and nobody has verified anything beyond 1 DNA test and some journals. I was doing what family does." I said, "Brielle is not a stranger. Brielle is my granddaughter." There was a pause. Then Joachim said, "She's been your granddaughter for 8 months. Ren and Theo have been your grandchildren for 6 years and 4 years. I wonder which ones you'd protect if you had to choose." I opened my mouth and nothing came out. I called Caleb that night. I told him everything. Caleb was quiet while I talked. Then he said, "He had no right to contact my lawyer. That is my family's private legal matter." But then I made the mistake of trying to smooth the edges. I said maybe Joachim was just being overprotective in his own clumsy way. Caleb said, "Mom, overprotective is asking questions at dinner. This is interference." He was right. The next morning I drove to Joachim's apartment. I sat across from him at his kitchen table and I said, "I need you to leave Brielle's situation alone. This is Caleb's family." Joachim leaned forward in his chair. He said, "Have they handled it? Or have they handled it the way emotional people handle things, by hoping everything works out?" He kept going. He said, "I found Petra's obituary online. Petra had a half-sister in another state. Did you know that? Because if there is family out there, and that family decides they want Brielle or they want money, your son is exposed." I did not know about a half-sister. I felt the floor tilt just slightly under me. Not because Joachim had won the argument, but because he had information I did not have. I called Marisol. I asked her if there was a half-sister. Marisol said, Petra did have a half-sister. They hadn't spoken in over a decade. Petra cut her off because the sister had substance problems. I asked if the half-sister knew about Brielle Brielle. Marisol said, she came to the funeral, she met Brielle once, she didn't ask for anything, and she left. I felt some of the tightness in my chest loosen, but the relief was only partial. Joachim had gone looking and found something real. That night I told Hendrik what I had learned. He sat in his chair in the living room and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Joachim has always been thorough. Maybe he's not wrong to worry. I felt something open between us. I said, he's not worried about Brielle's safety. He's trying to make us doubt her. Hendrik looked at me and said, or he's trying to make sure we don't get blindsided. That was when I understood. Joachim had gotten to Hendrik. The person I had expected to stand beside me without question was now standing in the middle. The next afternoon I went to Caleb and Octavia's house. Brielle was in the kitchen packing boxes. I sat down at the kitchen counter across from her. I said, Brielle, your uncle Joachim has been asking questions about your mom's family. I want to make sure you hear it from me before you hear it from him. Brielle's face went still. Not scared, not angry, just still in the way that a person's face goes when they are bracing for something they have been bracing for their whole life. She set down the towels. She said, what kind of questions? I told her. I kept my voice gentle. Brielle said, my mom's sister showed up at the funeral drunk. She asked Marisol how much my mom's apartment was worth. She didn't ask me a single question about how I was doing. My mom cut her off for a reason. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. I could see the fear sitting right underneath the anger like water under ice. I reached across the counter and put my hand over hers. I said, nobody is going anywhere. You are a part of this family, and that is not something Joachim or anyone else gets to undo. The going away dinner was 3 days out. I stared at Joachim's name on the guest list. I wanted to cross it out, but Hendrik found the list on the counter. He looked at me. He said, he's my brother. If you cut him out over questions, you make him right. You make it look like this family can't handle scrutiny. I agreed reluctantly. If I uninvited Joachim, it would become the story. The day before the dinner, my phone rang. It was Octavia. Her voice was tight. Octavia said, Joachim showed up at our house today while Caleb was at work. He sat in our living room and talked to Brielle alone for 20 minutes before I got home from picking up Ren. My hands went cold. I asked what he said. Octavia took a breath. She said, Brielle won't tell me everything. She said he asked her about her mom's finances. He asked her if Petra had left any debts. He asked her if Marisol had legal guardianship paperwork, or if it was informal. He asked her if she had ever thought about what would happen if Caleb and Octavia's marriage didn't survive the pressure of all this. I could not speak for a second. Octavia kept going. She said, he said that last part to an 18-year-old girl who lost her mother less than a year ago. He planted the idea that she could break up her father's marriage by existing. I called Joachim. I did not wait. I stood in the middle of my kitchen and I called him. And when he picked up, I did not keep my voice steady because I was done being steady. I said, you went to my son's house and questioned his daughter while he wasn't home. Joachim's voice came back flat. He said, I talked to a young woman who is about to go to college on someone else's money. I asked reasonable questions. I said, you asked her if her presence could end Caleb's marriage. That is not a reasonable question. That is cruelty dressed up as concern. There was a beat of silence and then his voice got harder. He said, you have been so busy being the perfect grandmother to this girl that you have forgotten to be a grandmother to Ren and Theo. When was the last time you spent a weekend with them without Brielle being the center of everything? I did not answer right away. The question landed closer to something real than I wanted it to. Not because it was true, but because I could not grab the last date fast enough. Joachim heard the silence. He heard it and I knew he was counting the seconds like a win. I hung up. Hendrik came in from the garage. I told him everything. I told him about Joachim going to the house. I told him what Joachim had said about Ren and Theo. Hendrik sat down across from me. He said, maybe I should talk to him. I looked at my husband. I said, I've been talking to him. He doesn't listen to talking. He escalates. Hendrik rubbed his hand over his face. He said it quietly. He's my brother. I said, and Brielle is my granddaughter. Your granddaughter. I need to know which one matters more to you right now. Hendrik did not answer. I called Caleb. I told him everything. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then his voice came through. It was past angry. It was decided. He said, he's not coming to the dinner. I said, your father wants him there. Caleb said, Dad can want whatever he wants. Joachim looked my daughter in the face and told her she might be a problem. He's not sitting at a table with her again until he understands what he did. I told Hendrik. I said, this is not a discussion. Hendrik looked at me for a long time. Then he stood up from his chair and walked out of the room without a word. The going away dinner arrived on Saturday evening. I had the table set for 8, not 9. Hendrik was there, but he was quiet. Marisol came through the door carrying a photo album. She handed it to Caleb and said, these are pictures Petra took of Brielle when she was little. I thought you should have them. Caleb opened the album and turned the pages slowly, looking at birthdays and school plays and ordinary Tuesday afternoons that he had missed. His fingers touched the edges of the photos like they were something breakable. Ren climbed into Brielle's lap and looked up at her and said, are you going to come back on weekends? Brielle wrapped her arms around Ren and said, every single one I can. Theo looked up and said, bring me something. Everyone laughed. For a few minutes I let myself believe it. Then the doorbell rang. My chest went tight. I did not move. Hendrik stood up before anyone else could and walked to the door and opened it. Joachim was standing on the porch in a jacket and tie, holding a wrapped gift against his chest. He said, I know I wasn't invited. I came anyway because I have something to say, and I'd rather say it when everyone is here than say it behind people's backs the way I've been doing. Caleb stood up from the table. His voice was flat. He said, you are not welcome here tonight. Joachim said, I know. I'm asking for 5 minutes. That's all. Octavia put her hand on Caleb's arm. She said quietly, let him talk. 5 minutes. Then he goes. Joachim stepped inside. He stood near the doorway holding the wrapped gift against his chest like a shield. He looked at Brielle. He said, I owe you an apology. Not the kind where I explain why I did what I did. The kind where I tell you that what I did was wrong and I know it. Brielle watched him, but she did not say a word. Joachim kept going. He said, I called your father's lawyer. I researched your mother's family. I came to this house when your father wasn't home, and I asked you questions that were designed to make you feel like you didn't belong here. I did all of that, and I told myself I was protecting this family. He paused. He said, but I wasn't protecting this family. I was angry at this family. The room went silent. Joachim's eyes were wet. He said, I have been Hendrik's brother for 58 years. I have been at every holiday, every birthday, every hospital visit, and when a girl none of us had met walked through that door, every person in this room opened their arms in 8 minutes. His voice cracked. He said, said, it took me 58 years to feel like I still didn't quite belong in this family. It took Brielle 8 minutes to belong completely. And instead of being glad for her, I was furious. I was furious that it was so easy for her, and it has never been easy for me. Hendrik stood up slowly. He said, Joachim. Joachim held up his hand. He said, let me finish. I made a kid who lost her mother feel like she was a threat. I did that because I am a grown man who still feels like the brother nobody needed. That is my problem. That was never Brielle's problem, and I am sorry. He set the wrapped gift on the counter. He said, that's a journal, blank, because your mother left you her words and I thought maybe you'd want a place to start your own. He turned toward the door. Brielle said, wait. Joachim stopped. Brielle stood up from the table. She said, my mom's journals are full of people who almost said what they meant. She wrote about all the things people were too scared to say out loud. You just said it out loud. That matters. She paused. She said, sit down. The food is still warm. Joachim looked at Caleb. Caleb's face was hard, but his eyes were wet. Caleb said, you have dinner. Then you and I are going to have a conversation tomorrow that will not be this gentle. Are we clear? Joachim nodded. He said, we're clear. Joachim sat down. Hendrik reached across the table and put his hand on his brother's shoulder. It was the first time I had seen Hendrik touch Joachim like that in years. The dinner finished. Ren fell asleep on the couch with her head on Brielle's lap. By the time Joachim got up to leave, Theo was asleep in Caleb's arms. I walked Joachim to the door. He looked older than he had looked when he arrived, like something heavy had finally been set down. He said, I meant what I said in there. I said, I know you did. That's why I'm telling you this. Belonging isn't something this family gives out in 8 minutes. You've belonged here for 58 years. You just never let yourself believe it. Joachim nodded once and walked to his car. I went back inside. Brielle was sitting alone at the table holding the blank journal Joachim had given her. She opened it to the first page and took a pen from her backpack and wrote one line and closed it. I did not ask what the line said. I did not need to. I sat beside my granddaughter and put my hand on Brielle's hand, and the two of us stayed at the table for a while, not talking, just sitting in the kind of quiet that only happens when a family has decided to be whole.